Speak a little bit about fiqh and then look at the topic that we're speaking about, inshallah. Firstly, I'd like to thank the masjid for organising this dawrah, where inshallah the community are able to, before the month of Ramadan, learn the halal and the haram as it pertains to fasting. This pillar of Islam, this act of ibadah, which is beloved to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and as is well known, knowledge precedes actions. And while many of us, or all of us, if you're of adult age, fast every single year, then there's still the benefit in making muraja'ah, of reviewing, as well as of learning the evidences from the Quran or from the Sunnah of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because the act itself is an act of ibadah, i.e. seeking knowledge, as the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, "Talabul ilm faridatun ala kulli Muslim." Seeking knowledge is an obligation on every Muslim. That being the case, fulfilling that obligation and seeking knowledge and sitting down to learn about al-Islam, learn about the pillars of Islam in detail, as it is mentioned in the books of fiqh, is by itself an act of ibadah that a person is rewarded for, even if it's something that he already knows. Okay, a person knows how to pray, but he continues praying 5 times a day until he dies. The person knows the nawafil, he still continues doing it, and he's always seeking to perfect it, right? And by the ways in which a person is able to perfect his salah is by seeking knowledge of Allah, who he's praying to, seeking knowledge of the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who he's following in how to pray, right? The do's and the don'ts. So it's always a continuous thing that a person does. So that being the case as well, likewise as well, every single Ramadan that comes, a person wants to make it better than the Ramadan that preceded. A person wants to make the most of the blessed month of Ramadan, to utilize his time in a way which is, I won't say productive, but in a way which he doesn't lose out. He doesn't lose out on the blessings of that time, because time is the most invaluable resource that every single Muslim has, or every single person has. And it's one of those things that once it's spent, you can't get it back. The money in your pocket, you spend it today, and next week you'll have more money in your pocket. But the time that you utilized, that you used that last week, you're never going to get it back. And it's a clock which is continually ticking down. So that being the case, the month of Ramadan and sitting down to seek knowledge about the rulings of fasting, it's an act of ibadah, as long as the person makes it intention for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is what we should all do first and foremost. Why are we sitting here to learn about the fiqh of Siyam? We know how to fast, we know what breaks our fast, so that we can draw closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by sitting down and learning. So the first thing to do is to correct our intentions. The second thing is looking at fiqh itself. This topic that we're speaking about is the topic of the halal and the haram. It's knowledge of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands us to do and doing it, and it's knowledge of what Allah forbids us from and abstaining from it. Okay, and it's called fiqh, right? It's called fiqh, which is, if you translate it, it's called Islamic jurisprudence, but it's called fiqh, and it's based on the hadith, or it means an understanding of the deen, i.e. the general meaning of fiqh. When you say fiqh, right, it means understanding of the entire religion, the usul of the deen and the furu' of the deen. The usul of the deen being ikhlas and ibadah, i.e. that is for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, i.e. knowledge of Allah. And the furu' of the deen being the actions that a person does on a daily basis, right, in worship of Allah, the salat and the siyam and the zakat and the hajj, birrul walidain, and all the other acts of ibadah that a person does. And we know that because of the hadith of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, yuridillahu bihi khayran yufaqihu fi din. If Allah wants good for a person, He gives him fiqh in the religion, meaning He gives him understanding of the deen. He makes him a person that has ilm of the ahkam of the sharia. A person that has knowledge of the rulings of the sharia, he has insight. Okay? And this knowledge of fiqh the book that's being used, Daleel At-Taalib, is a book on fiqh, right? And it mentions the rulings pertaining to fasting and the other acts of ibadah, okay? Daleel At-Taalib is a book on Hanbali fiqh specifically that mentions ibadat and mu'amalat and the other chapters. However, it being a book on fiqh, right, it doesn't mean that it's not based upon the Quran or based upon the Sunnah of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because fiqh as a subject, as you're going to see, is derived from the Quran, from the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, from ijma', which is a consensus of the scholars, and from al-qiyas, which is analogy, which is valid, right? Valid qiyas. So the subject itself is derived from those sources, i.e., it's derived from the sources of revelation, the speech of Allah and the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. As you're going to see, the author will mention an issue, right? As he mentioned, for example, Sawm Ramadan, yajibu, Sawm Ramadan, it begins, it's an obligation to fast a month of Ramadan. Okay, this word yajibu shows obligation. Okay, where does he get it from? He didn't make it up. He didn't make the ruling himself. He took it from the Quran, he took it from the Sunnah, right? So that's where the books of fiqh, they're derived and they're based upon verses in the Quran and ahadith of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and then they formulated it into books to make it easier to understand. And the book is Daleel At-Taalib. As for the hukum of studying fiqh, or the ruling of studying fiqh, then it's a obligation upon every person in that which is related to the things which he must do. So for example, a person has to pray 5 times a day, he has to know the rulings of salah. He has to know the things that nullify his salah. He has to know the things that are conditions for the validity of his salah. A person, for example, is going to go on hajj, because he's now, Allah's blessed him with ability, he's got money, he has to now know, for example, what are the pillars of hajj, what are the actions he should do at hajj. If you're going to get married, right, you're single at the moment, you don't need to know what the rights of the wife are. You don't need to know what your rights are, right? But you're going to get married, then now you have to know what are the rights of the wife, what is it that I should be given, not because she's asked for it, but because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made it an obligation, right? The wife, what is it that I have to be doing? Not because he wants me to do it, but because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes it an obligation. This is the contract. But before you get married, you might not have to know about that. So seeking knowledge of fiqh is an obligation for the things which are required for you to practice at that time. So the moment it becomes an obligation, you have to have knowledge of those issues. Naam. And with regards to the issues of fiqh, then they come down to issues either of ibadat, the relationship you have with your creator, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or mu'amalat, things related to your akhirah and things related to your dunya. Your akhirah is your salat, right? You pray, you're not praying to a person to get something from them, you're praying to Allah alone, right? So it's pertaining to your akhirah. Your sawm is pertaining to your akhirah, there's no dunya in it for you. Actually, you're losing out on dunya because you're abstaining from things in the dunya, desires. Hajj, zakat, these things are all to do with ibadah or to do with the akhirah. You have things, rulings pertaining to your dunya, marriage, children, business, money, halal money, haram money. This is all pertaining to your dunya, but has an effect in your afterlife, but it's pertaining to your dunya, right? So, which is why you find some people may be doing actions which are Islamic for their dunya, but they're not getting rewarded by Allah, and other people are doing actions which are Islamic for their dunya, and they're getting rewarded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at the same time. Why? Because of intention. Because they know that this is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded, they're not doing it based upon taqleed or culture. Other people that may be doing something Islamic based upon culture, but not because Allah commanded it in the Quran or in the Sunnah, in which case they fulfilled an obligation, but they're not going to get rewarded in the afterlife, but they're still doing something for their dunya, which is of benefit for their dunya. So you find the books of fiqh, it covers 2 aspects. Aspects pertaining to the afterlife and aspects pertaining to this worldly life. When we speak about sawm, fasting, we're speaking about something which is specific for Allah alone. You get the reward for it in the afterlife, and it's not for the dunya. A person that fasts because they want to get healthy, because they want to lose weight, they think it's going to make their skin look better, right? That fast is not a fast in Islam, right? That fast is not a fast in Islam, meaning that that person is not worshipping Allah. by fasting. So the sole purpose and intention behind fasting is for Allah. That you can't share your intention with fasting with anything else. It has to be for Allah alone, which we're going to see. So when it comes to fiqh as a subject, then it covers all of these aspects, the usul and the furu', ibadah and other than that. But specifically speaking, when you say fiqh, I'm going to be studying fiqh today, the fiqh of salat, the fiqh of sawm, the fiqh of hajj, the fiqh of zakat. What you're speaking about is al-ilm bil-ahkam al-shar'iyya al-amaliyya al-muktasaba min adillatiha al-tafsiliyya. That's the definition that they give. It's knowledge, al-ilm, so it has to be knowledge, Quran, Sunnah, right? Bil-ahkam al-shar'iyya, of the Islamic rulings. This is wajib, this is haram, this is mustahab, this is makruh, this is an obligation, this is a recommendation, this is something which is impermissible, prohibited, right? Where do we get those rulings from? Al-muktasaba min adillatiha at-tafsila, from the specific evidences in the Quran and the Sunnah. Okay, which highlights that what's binding upon me and you, what's binding upon the Muslim is what Allah says and what the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam says. That's what's binding, right? As for everything else, then it has to be an understanding of those two things for me to be able to act upon it or practice it. If it's not, i.e. it's a person came up with it himself through a theory and a hypothesis or whatever, then it's not binding. There's nothing that binds you to it. The only thing that binds you is the Quran and the Sunnah and the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. As for the benefits of fiqh, i.e. the fruits of fiqh, then there's two. Number one, that's when your ibadah and your mu'amala, it becomes valid, right? And you do the action according to the way which is going to bring about the effect, which is a reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Without fiqh, that's not possible, right? Without fiqh, that's not possible. A person just stands up and starts to pray however he wants to pray. His prayer is valid or invalid? Invalid. Even if he has sincerity, he can have ikhlas. He's doing it for Allah. But he's not doing it how it should be done. He doesn't do the rak'ah. He doesn't do the sajda or the ruku'. He doesn't do the sajda. He just stands up for the whole prayer. Counts, doesn't count. Accepted by Allah, not accepted. Not accepted. Why? Because it doesn't have fiqh. So the benefit of fiqh and knowing fiqh is that your actions are valid and you know when they're valid and you know what invalidates your actions. Also from the benefits of fiqh, from the primary benefits of fiqh, is that a person has success in this worldly life and success in the afterlife. Which is why the scholars, when they speak about subjects that a student studies, right? They speak about subjects that the student studies, they say fiqh is ummul ulum. Fiqh as a subject is the mother of all the sciences and subjects that a person studies. Okay? And here when they speak about fiqh in this regard, they're speaking about two things. Usul and furu', i.e. fiqh, knowledge of Allah, and fiqh, knowledge of how to worship Allah. That's what they're speaking about. And it's the main science because it teaches you what the halal and the haram is. The virtue of studying fiqh, the virtue and the benefits, i.e. what makes this subject so virtuous, the hadith we mentioned earlier, the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Man yuridillahu bihi khayran yufaqihu fi din." If Allah wants good for a person, He gives him fiqh in the religion, i.e. understanding of the halal and the haram and knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? If a person has knowledge of chemistry, physics, engineering, the difficult highest level of mathematics, for example, right? But he has no knowledge of Allah and no knowledge of halal and haram, it's not going to benefit him fully, right? It's not going to benefit him. A person can be the most intelligent person, have the highest IQ in the dunya, but that IQ hasn't brought him to the realization that Allah created him and he has to worship Allah, and Allah sent revelation and He sent messengers. That person has not benefited. Why? Man yuridillahu bihi khayran yufaqihu fi din. He gives him fiqh of the deen, fiqh of Islam, fiqh of knowledge of halal and haram, and fiqh of knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Not fiqh in science and mathematics and all these other subjects that a person may study. So when you're going to weigh things up, and this is important for all of us, as in terms of how you deal with students of knowledge of the scholars and the people that stand up in the front and lead the salat for Tarawih and people that have been honored with that, don't treat them like they're less qualified and less significant than a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer or these other people, right? That people strive for happy for their kids to be like, right? They're both important, but one gives you success in this life and the next life. The other one will only give you something of success in this worldly life, right? So it's not to dismiss one, but also at the same time make sure you put everything in its place. So that's an introduction to fiqh as a subject. Going straight into the book of fiqh of Siyam, right? Kitab al-Siyam. The author, the book is called Daleel At-Taalib. Daleel At-Taalib, the guide or the student's guide. And it's one of the shorter books and one of the primary texts in studying fiqh. So it's a fiqh manual basically, right? It's a fiqh manual. And every single Muslim has concern obviously for what they're doing in terms of their acts of ibadah should study at the very least the first 5 books in a book of fiqh, i.e. fiqh of salah, of zakat, of sawm and of hajj, right? The reason why zakat, even if you're poor, you should study fiqh of zakat because it's going to give you the ambition to become wealthy so you can be a person that fulfills that pillar of Islam, right? You don't have to give zakat until you're wealthy. But if you never ever read the book of zakat, saying to yourself, well, I'm poor, it doesn't apply to me, you'll never aspire and have the ambition necessarily to be wealthy for the sake of giving zakat. You might have an ambition of being wealthy, but that's going to be not for the reason which is going to make you wealthy. The reason that's going to make you wealthy is that you're doing it because you want to benefit the Muslims, because you want to do it for Allah, because you want to be able to be the person that has that level up. Not only do you pray, but you pray and you give zakat, for example, right? So to do that, you have to know what's in the book. So it's a must for every single Muslim in fiqh, in the subject, at least to finish the Kitab al-Ibadat in any of the books of fiqh that you're going to be studying, that your teacher would recommend that you study. So in this regard, what's going to be going on in this dawrah, in this conference, inshallah, is going to look at the Kitab of Siyam from this book, Daleel At-Taalib. So the author, he mentions, يَجِبُ صَوْمُ رَمَضَانِ بِرُؤْيَةِ هِلَالِهِ عَلَى جَمِيعِ النَّاسِ. That's the first phrase. He says that it's an obligation for everyone to fast the month of Ramadan upon sighting the crescent moon. This line, it mentions 2 points. It mentions more than 2 points, but we'll focus on 2. Number 1, what's the hukum of fasting? What's the ruling? It says it's wajib. يَجِبُ صَوْمُ رَمَضَانِ. يَجِبُ means it's a wajib. What does wajib mean? That means that if a person does it, he's rewarded, and if a person doesn't do it, he's under threat of punishment from Allah for leaving off something which is an obligation. يَجِبُ صَوْمُ رَمَضَانَ. It's an obligation to fast Ramadan, i.e. the month of Ramadan, which is either, we're going to say 29 or 30 days, بِرُؤْيَةِ هِلَالِهِ عَلَى جَمِيعِ النَّاسِ. When he sights the moon, i.e. by the sighting of the moon on all of mankind. There's 2 issues here. When does the month begin? And once it's begun, who is it an obligation to fast? So the first one, it says, بِرُؤْيَةِ hilal, i.e. by the sighting of the hilal, which is the new moon, the crescent moon, which is based on these 2 points. Like I said, this is a book, he doesn't mention adillah. Every mas'ala that he mentions, he has proof for it, right? So for example, the obligation of fasting, what's the evidence for that? فَمَنْ شَهِدَ مِنْكُمُ الشَّهْرَ فَلْيَصُمْهُ. Whoever sights the moon, whoever sights the moon, then let him fast, or then he must fast. That ayah in the Quran, it says, فَمَنْ شَهِدَ مِنْكُمُ الشَّهْرَ فَلْيَصُمْهُ. Whoever sights the moon, then he fasts. That covers both of these issues. Number 1, the obligation of fasting at the sighting of the new moon. As for just the obligation of fasting, then you have the hadith of Abdul ibn Umar where he says that Islam is built upon 5 pillars. And he mentions the 5 pillars of Islam, and in there he mentions Sawm Ramadan. So that's the evidence for also it being an obligation. So he says, يَجِبُ صَوْمُ رَمَضَانِ بِرُؤْيَةِ هِلَالِهِ عَلَى جَمِيعِ النَّاسِ, upon everyone. Okay, this is an issue. Okay, i.e. who should fast when the moon is being sighted? I.e. you haven't sighted it. Somebody else has sighted it and told you the moon has been sighted. Is it an obligation on you to go and now sight it yourself? Right? فَمَنْ شَهِدَ الشَّهْرَ فَلْيَصُمْ. Whoever sights it, then he fasts. Do you now mean that you also fast, or just him? Or do you have to go? Here he says, عَلَى جَمِيعِ النَّاسِ, upon everyone. Right? So not just the one that sighted it, but everyone that knows and has been told that the moon has been sighted, wherever they are. Wherever they are. And that's the position of the Hanbali madhab. Right? That wherever you are, if the moon's been sighted in somewhere else, doesn't matter if they have the same matala as you, as if the moon is seen at the same time, everyone has to fast. As long as you've received the information, everyone has to fast. That's one position. Right? The other position is no, each place, each area, each iqlim, each kind of area has its own sighting. Has its own sighting. Meaning that even if it's been sighted in Australia, if it hasn't been sighted in the areas which are considered part of the European areas, whether it's Morocco, then you don't have to fast. That's the second position basically. Here you can see ala jami', that shows you what? That it's on everyone, wherever they are. وَعَلَى مَنْ حَالَ دُونَهُ وَدُونَ مَطْلَعِهِ غَيْمٍ أَوْ قَطْرٍ. Then it says, similarly, it's an obligation for those who are prevented from sighting the moon owing to it being too overcast or clouds, or with the presence of dust. لَيْلَةَ الثَّلَاثِينَ مِنْ شَعْبَانَ, on the 30th night of Sha'ban. This is the next issue. When do you fast? You fast when the moon's been sighted. Okay, what if the moon can't be sighted? He says here, similarly, it is an obligation for those who are prevented from sighting the moon owing to it being too overcast with clouds or with the presence of dust during the 30th night of Sha'ban. So now it's the 30th night of Sha'ban, right? Which would be when? Let's work it out now. What day is it on Sha'ban today? What day is it today? 26. No, don't guess. We don't need to guess. We've got phones. Everyone's got a smartphone. It takes you 2 seconds. Guessing is not needed in today's age. Okay? There's no need to guess. And don't do it either, because if you guess and you give an answer and it's wrong, that's called jahal murakkab. Compound ignorance. Alhamdulillah. Good. So today's the 26th of Sha'ban. Right? Tonight will be what? 27th night of Sha'ban. Maghrib time becomes 27th. 29th of Sha'ban is the 30th of Sha'ban is going to be when? Huh? Is that going to be Wednesday? So tonight's the 27th of Sha'ban and tonight is Saturday, Sunday 28th, Monday, it's going to be Tuesday. That's going to be the 30th of Sha'ban. 29th day, 30th, the night becomes the 30th. Okay, what if at that time, Tuesday, they go to sight the moon, but it's cloudy and it's overcast? What do you do? What does the author say you do? It's obligatory for those who are prevented from sighting the moon owing to it being too overcast with clouds or with the presence of dust during the 30th night of Sha'ban. The next day was going to be for him a day of fasting. Has he sighted the moon? No. Why do they say it's fasting? It's based upon a hadith and the understanding of a hadith, right? The Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, إذا رأيتموه فصوموا وإذا رأيتموه فأفطروا فإذا غم عليكم فاقدروا له. Or كما قال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. He says, when you see the moon, fast. When you see the moon, break your fast, meaning the beginning of the month, the end of the month. But if it's cloudy, then estimate it. What do the scholars understand from this estimate? Some scholars understand from this estimate the meaning to ضيقوه, based upon a verse in the Quran. ضيقوه meaning count that month of Sha'ban as 29 days and make the next day be the first of Ramadan. That's one view. And that's the view of the madhab. That's why they mention what they mention. The other view, which is the correct view and the stronger view, based upon another hadith as well, is no, count Sha'ban as 30 days. Estimate Sha'ban as being 30 days, not as 29. And you're not going to be fasting the following day. Is that understood? Alright, so you have two views. The madhab says the next day you're going to be fasting, even if you haven't sighted the moon, because it's overcast. Why? What's the reasoning? Number one, the hadith, and the other instance here, he says, ihtiyatan. Right? Ihtiyat. What does it mean, ihtiyat? You're fasting out of caution. out of caution that it's possible that night the moon was there but you couldn't see it. And the madhab of the Hanabila is they act upon ihtiyat, i.e. it's possible tomorrow is going to be Ramadan and I don't want to be starting the day eating. So I'm going to make my intention for the next day to be fasting and fast the following day even though I haven't sighted the moon. The other view on this issue is no, you have to count it for 30 days because there's another narration of the same hadith that mentions فَأَكْمِلُ الشَّعْبَانِ 30 يَوْمًا. Complete Sha'ban 30 days. Okay, and that's the opinion of a large majority of the scholars, especially the contemporary ones. So in any case, we've now seen two ways in which you're going to begin the beginning of Ramadan. Either one, the moon's been sighted, or it wasn't possible to sight the moon, in which case you're going to count the month of Sha'ban 30 days, and the next day, following day is not going to be considered Ramadan, or according to the book, the next day will be considered Ramadan on the madhab. He says, look, it's also an obligation, ihtiyatan bi niyati Ramadan, with the intention of it being Ramadan the following day. Why is that important? That's important because innamal a'mal bin niyat, actions are by intention. So you have to have the intention of it being the Ramadan for your fast to be valid. You can't have the intention that I don't know it's Ramadan, but I'm going to fast on the off chance that it is Ramadan tomorrow. Right? Your intention has to be, I'm fasting tomorrow as the first day of Ramadan, for it to be count for you and to be valid. Okay? So it says, Biniti Ramadan wa yujzi'u, and then it says, now it becomes valid. In dhahara minhu, if then it says the fast is done with intention fast for Ramadan as a safety measure, ihtiyatan. Commencing the month this way is acceptable even if the crescent moon appeared in another location. Right? وتصلى التراويح ولا تثبت ببقية الأحكام كوقوع الطلاق والعتق وحلول الأجل. Okay, and that would mean that you're going to start praying the Taraweeh prayer that night as well. As for the remainder of the ahkam, like for example, he says, similarly the Ramadan night prayers can be performed. However, the remaining Islamic legislation cannot come into effect, which are related to the start of the month, such as the occurrence of divorce, manumission of slaves, and the deadline of deferred payments. Okay, there's other ahkam that are connected to times, connected to dates, right? If a man divorces his wife, the iddah is how long? 3 menses, right? Or in some cases it could be 3 months. In the case that it's 3 months now, and the day, the 30th of Sha'ban, it was overcast, so you don't know if tomorrow is going to be the new month or not. Can he take her back the following day or not? He's got 3 months iddah. This is the final month, the 3rd month of the iddah, right? It's going to end the moment the next month begins. The next month's begun for you in terms of fasting, but in terms of the remaining rulings, it hasn't begun. Is that understood? Meaning that if the 1st of Ramadan, you change your mind, she's sweeted you up enough, she's persuaded you why she's the best wife for you, and you're never going to find someone like her, and she's done her best to make sure she keeps you, you change your mind on the last, or let's say the final hour, the last day. In that case, if you took her back on that day, the 1st of Ramadan, it wouldn't be considered the following month for the baqiyat al-ahkam, for the rest of the rulings. That's what he means here. It applies to fasting, it doesn't apply to other rulings. If you had a debt which was due on the beginning of the month, right? In this case, that debt will be due on the 2nd of Ramadan, not on the first day, because the night was overcast. That's what he's speaking about here. Then he says, how do you know it's... He goes, وَتَثْبُتُ رُؤْيَةُ هِلَالِهِ بِخَبْرِ مُسْلِمٍ مُكَلَّفٍ عَدْلٍ وَلَوْ عَبْدًا أَوْ أُنْثَى. Here it speaks about who's the one that you take the khabar from, that the month has begun. Okay? He says, the statement of a single, one person, trustworthy, accountable Muslim. 4 conditions, right? Or 4 things. It's okay if it's only one person that tells you. It doesn't have to be 2. This is according to the madhab. Other scholars say 2 people have to see the moon. Here it says 1 person, which is correct. The second thing, they have to be, what does it say? Muslim. There has to be a Muslim. If a non-Muslim comes and says, the moon's been sighted, tomorrow's Ramadan, can you fast? No. Has to be Muslim. Second thing, has to be someone who is mukallaf. If a little child, 7 years old, 6 years old comes, Dad, I saw the moon, tomorrow's Ramadan. Can you fast? No. Why? He's not mukallaf, right? i.e. he's not of the age of liability, right? It doesn't apply to him, so he has to be mukallaf. Or if the person comes, he's majnoon, he's got schizophrenia, or he's got another mental illness, a proper mental illness, right? He comes and he says, the moon's been sighted. He comes and announces it in the masjid. Can you fast that following day? Why? He's not mukallaf. If he prayed, his prayers, it's not obligatory for him to pray. He's not mukallaf, so you can't take his khabar for sighting of the moon. He has to be mukallaf. Also, he has to be adl. What does adl mean? Trustworthy. What does trustworthy mean? What does it mean to be trustworthy? This is an important characteristic of a Muslim. Huh? Not just truthful. Reliable. What does reliable? What does adala mean? Doesn't commit major sins, doesn't persist in minor sins. He's not a fasiq. He's not a major sinner. He doesn't drink khamar, doesn't gamble, right? He stays away from zina. He stays away from the major sins, and the minor sins he doesn't persist, right? Because a person that does major sins is called a fasiq. A person that persists on minor sins, doesn't care about them, does them, no big deal, is also considered a fasiq, because lots of minor sins make up a major sin, right? The more little wrong things you do, they turn into big things. So he's not known for lying, dishonesty, cheating, stealing, all these things. He's not, because those people, their witness is rejected, right? I.e., what happens when you go to court? So you're calling a witness, right? You call your witness, your lawyer calls your witness to defend you, or to give a witness statement, isn't it? What does the other solicitor say? No, you can't accept his witness. Why? Because he's a criminal. He's used to do this, he used to do that. They belittle his adala, because that discredits his reliability as a witness. In Islam we have adala. Adala means he doesn't do major sins and he doesn't persist upon minor sins. When he say he doesn't do major sins, meaning if he does a major sin, he makes tawbah. Right? He stops, doesn't do it again. He has remorse, major sins. Minor sins doesn't persist on it. So the person has to have adala as well. A person comes and says, oh, I sighted the moon. And you can smell cannabis on him, or you can smell alcohol on him. What do you say? No, someone else go see. Where did he see it? Go have a look. Why? He doesn't have adala, isn't it? Reputation, right? He doesn't have reputation. So a Muslim has to have adala as well, generally speaking. But in the case of being a witness for someone, you'll get rejected. Once I was at a court, I might have mentioned this before, bear with me if I did. I was sitting in a mahkama in the Mamlaka in Saudi, and there was a judge, and there was a case he was doing. I was there sitting waiting to see him. And a young guy comes, a young Saudi guy, and he was up for something, I forgot what it was. He goes, where's your witnesses? He brings 2 witnesses. The guys come in, the judge says, do you smoke cigarettes? Because you can smell it. He says, yeah. He says, no, go. Kick them out. He says, go get 2 more witnesses that don't smoke. It's hard in this day and age, huh? Right, maybe that's a bit strict, right? Because smoking obviously goes against the dalil. But if you need to establish huquq, establish people's rights, you need witnesses. If you say a person doesn't smoke, it's going to be hard to find enough witnesses in the cases because a lot of people smoke. Or you say a person doesn't shave their beard, right? How are you going to find? How many percentage of the Muslims grow their beard? How many percentage shave it? Right? So sometimes adala, as Shaykh Uthaymin mentions, can be nisbi, relative to the place, relative to the people, it's relative to the time, somewhat. Otherwise, if we made it according to the strict versions that they mention here, a lot of the huquq of people will be lost because you won't find people that have adala except for a handful, a small amount. In any case, that's one of the conditions, so it has to be adlun. Then he mentions, وَلَوْ عَبْدًا أَوْ أُنْثَى, even if the person is a slave, i.e. not free. That doesn't exist in our time. Or untha, or the person is a female. So in this case, the testimony of women is accepted. That's what he's highlighting. In some cases, the testimony of women is not accepted. In some cases, only the testimony of women is accepted. And testimony of men won't be accepted. Okay? There's different cases in which testimony of women, sometimes testimony of 2 women is needed to equate to 1 man. So there's different circumstances. In any case, he says, وَتَثْبُتُ بَقِيَّةُ الْأَحْكَامِ تَبْعًا. Then he says, and also the remaining Islamic legislation comes into effect. I.e., if they cite the moon, all the other legislation we spoke about, talaq and stuff like that, also comes into effect. He says, وَلَا يَقْبُلُ فِي بَقِيَّةِ الشُّهُورِ إِلَّا رَجُلَانِ عَدْلَانِ. At the rest of the months, only 2 witnesses are accepted. So here the madhab, it makes a distinction between the beginning of Ramadan, which is an act of ibadah, which is huge, and the rest of the months. For the start of Ramadan, the madhab accepts 1 witness. The other madhab don't. They say 2 as well. For the end of Ramadan and the rest of the months, the start of they say there has to be 2 witnesses. Why? Why do they distinguish? They distinguish based upon hadith, based upon evidence. The Hanbali madhab is known as the Athari madhab because Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, he would always look for a hadith over analogy and ra'i, opinion. So there's a hadith where someone came to the Messenger of Allah, I forgot the name of the Sahabi, and said, I've sighted the moon, 1 person, I think it was Abdul ibn Umar anhuma, sighted the moon. So the Messenger of Allah said, fast, and ordered the people to fast. So that evidence shows that for the sighting of Ramadan, 1 person was accepted. So based upon that, they apply that, and the hadith is authentic. That's with regards to when the month begins. Right? When the month begins. So when the month begins, there's a number of issues. So the month begins 1 of 3 ways. Number 1, moon sighted, and you're informed. Number 2, the month of Sha'ban completes 30 days. Right? Because the month is only ever 29 or 30 days. It can never be 31 days. The third way is, what they speak about here, is if it's overcast and you can't see, what do? Do you fast or not fast? That's the third way, right? The madhab says fast. The majority of the scholars say, no, you don't fast that day. You complete the month 30 days. Subsection, there are 4 prerequisites for the fast to be obligatory. Here it speaks about وَشَرَطُ وُجُوبِ الصَّوْمِ أَرْبَعَةُ أَشْيَاء. The conditions for it to become an obligation. I.e., when is it an obligation for a person to fast? At what point? Number 1, al-Islam. The person has to be a Muslim. If you're not a Muslim, it's not an obligation for you to fast. If you're a Muslim, it's an obligation for you to fast. There's an issue that comes up, which is when shabab, young people, especially in the UK, right? Because it's an un-Islamic environment, so it's not like the whole society is fasting. No, just Muslims are fasting, right? As a result of that, you find kids in secondary school, in college, they go into school, none of their friends are fasting, so they don't really fast properly, right? They're Muslim, it's an obligation on them to fast, but they're negligent, so some days they break their fast without having a valid excuse. And this happens continuously, year after year after year after year. 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, then they come to the mosque and they become serious, they become adults, they start earning money, they got responsibilities, they realize, hold on a minute, I messed up. I didn't fast those days. What do I do now? What do they do? Do they just make tawbah? Do they have to make up those days? What's the situation? Were they Muslim, number 1? Number 2, were they above the age of puberty? Al-bulugh, the second condition for fasting to become an obligation, above the age of puberty. Were they above the age of puberty? Number 3, did they have sound mind? Right? They had sound mind. They weren't someone that had schizophrenia or they had a mental illness. Number 4, did they have the wal-qudratu alayhi? Did they have the ability to fast? Right? Meaning they had a healthy body. They weren't sick. For example, they weren't ill. They didn't have an illness that prevents them from fasting. Right? An autoimmune disease, which means you can't fast full stop and you have to feed. If they meet these 4 conditions, then it's an obligation to fast. And if they didn't fast, whatever days it is, then they owe those fasts. They have to make them up. It's a debt that they owe to Allah, and they have to make it up before they die. And if they don't make it up, it has to be made up out of any money which they leave behind. Why? Because it's an obligation. And it's lifted when it's fulfilled. It's lifted when it's fulfilled. Okay, so if they did do that, they have to make up, as long as they meet these 4 conditions. These are the 4 prerequisites for the fast to be an obligation. Then you have prerequisites for the fast to be valid. There's a difference. If a person meets these 4, then it's an obligation for them to fast. Then he mentions whoever's unable to fast. So now he mentions al-qudratu alayhi, ability to fast. Okay, what is ability? What isn't ability? Number 1, فَمَنْ عَجِزَ عَنْهُ لِكِبَرٍ أَوْ مَرَضٍ لَا يُرْجَى زَوَالُهُ أَفْطَرَ وَأَطْعَمَ عَنْ كُلِّ يَوْمٍ مِسْكِينًا مُدَّبِرٍ أَوْ نِصْفَ صَاعٍ مِنْ غَيْرِهِ. Whoever's unable, incapable of fasting, owing to number 1, old age. Okay, so they've got old age. Due to old age, they're unable to fast. Or they have a medical condition which is incurable. Right? They have a condition which is incurable. There's no hope for them to be cured. Right? Those 2 people are the 2 people that don't have to fast. Consensus. All the scholars say these 2 people don't have to fast. There's no difference of opinion on these 2 people. If they're of old age or they have a disease which is incurable, they don't have to fast. A disease that affects them fasting, then they don't have to fast. But what do they do instead? Instead of fasting, they have to feed a poor person for every day of that month, that Ramadan. So if it's 30 days, you have to feed 30 poor people. Either all at once, invite 30 poor people and feed them, or one each day a poor person. It's up to them, but they have to feed 30 poor people, or 29, depends on how long the month is. And there's an amount, i.e. a poor person, and the amount they have to give should be a mud of wheat or half a sa', a kilogram of other food stuff for each day. In other words, you feed them a portion which is a portion that you'd eat yourself, right? It has a certain amount. So it's enough to suffice them. When it comes to eating in Ramadan, we have an issue. We're 1 of 3 people. And because of the nature of let's say relative privilege, because it's not always privilege, but relative privilege, we tend to fall into the wrong category when it comes to eating in the month of Ramadan. And it's societal, it's not necessarily something which is kind of, all the time blameworthy. People eat, they're 1 of 3 people. They either overeat, or they eat moderately, or they eat what suffices them. The best one is eat what suffices you. The worst one is overeating, and in between that is moderately eating. Moderate eating is what the Messenger of Allah described as 1/3 for your food, 1/3 for drink, and 1/3 to breathe. Right? A Muslim eats in thirds. His portion that he doesn't eat until he can't eat anymore, or drink until he can't, and then drink. He doesn't eat until he's so full, and then drink and he's got no space for breathing. Right? Meaning that he always leaves space in his stomach. He's never fully, completely full. That's the take home. That's the moderate. The worst one is the one where he eats so much that he's always full up when he's breaking his iftar, right? Or even at suhoor time. You have 2 times you're going to be eating in Ramadan: iftar and suhoor. If at iftar or suhoor you're like that, then you need to change, right? Because you're not benefiting yourself in terms of your ibadah, in terms of your eating habits. The one which is sufficient is the one that only eats enough to be able to work and to worship. Right, so he doesn't even eat 1/3 or drink 1/3. He eats just enough, and he eats also the things which he knows is going to benefit his body, right? In terms of has good high energy or has high carbs or stuff like that. Any case, when it comes to feeding a person, you feed them a mud or a nisf al-sa'. From what I remember, it mentions 0.65 kilograms or 1.3 kilograms. One of these 2. So between these 2 amounts of food. There are 6 prerequisites for the fasting to be correct. Now we're talking about shurutus sihha, i.e. conditions for obligation are different to conditions for validity. Here, what makes the fast valid? Number 1, you have al-Islam as well. I.e. if you're non-Muslim fasting, there's no reward for that person. It's not valid, it doesn't count. For fasting to count for you to be rewarded, you have to be Muslim. The second one is in the case of women specifically, that she's not on her menstrual cycle. If she fasts while she's on her menstrual cycle, the fast doesn't count. If a menstrual cycle comes while she's fasting during the day, then she has to make up that day, even if it came 5 minutes before iftar. A minute before the iftar, time of iftar, the Maghrib comes in. If she comes on a menstrual cycle, that day does not count. She has to make it up. Right? The scholars differ on whether if she continues fasting, if it comes in during the day or not, due to the sanctity of the day, it being Ramadan, and she started it fasting, she ends it fasting, and has to make it up or not. But as for having to make it up, they don't differ. She has to make it up. The second thing is that she can't be postnatal bleeding either. So if she's postnatal bleeding at the start of Ramadan and she fasts, those fasts don't count. The third one is that they have to have tamyiz. I.e. tamyiz as it applies to kids is different from bulugh. Right? Bulugh is when a child becomes an adult, a young adult, they become pubescent, right? Before that, there's a state in which they know right from wrong. It's called tamyiz. The scholars mention the age as being around 7 or 10. Or other than that, they say, as he mentions here, it doesn't mention here, is if they're given he has the rushd. He understands the command and is able to fulfill it. I.e., he's of the age where he understands right from wrong, basically. Right? That's usually about 7, 8 at that age anyway. In which case, it's if he fasts, his fast is valid, but it's not an obligation for him to fast. So the children that are 8, 9, 10, for example, and they fast, their fast is valid. You don't say to them, no, don't fast. If your parents say, the child says, oh, I want to fast Mommy Day, I want to fast today. You don't say, no, don't fast, you don't have to, it's not an obligation. That's a mistake. You say you help them, you encourage them to fast because they get into the habit of doing the act of ibadah, which is going to become an obligation later. Also, you have intellect, number 5. They have to have intellect. Right? He says here, if a person makes intention to intellect is an obligation for the validity of fast, or a condition for the validity of fast. If a person makes intention to fast at night, but then lost his sanity or became unconscious for the whole day, only regaining consciousness for a small portion of it, such fast will be considered correct. A person has intention to fast at night. We said you have to have sound mind. You have to be conscious. Okay? You have to be conscious for your fast to be valid. Meaning that if you're of not sound mind or unconscious, like in a coma, your fast is invalid. However, there's a situation. If a person makes the intention to fast at night, but then lost his sanity or became unconscious for the whole day, only regaining consciousness for a small portion of the day, his fast is valid. Meaning, he went to bed with the intention to fast the following day, Ramadan. He woke up, or he didn't wake up in the morning, right? Or he woke up and he wasn't of sound mind, right? Meaning that he woke up and he was majnoon in the morning. He was majnoon for most of the day. The last part of the day, the last hour, the last 20 minutes, he regained sanity. Or he was unconscious for the whole day because he woke up at suhoor before suhoor time, having his suhoor, and then he became unconscious for whatever reason. Right? He fainted, had a fit, and he was unconscious for the whole day. But he caught a part of the day. His fast is valid. Why? Because he had the intention to fast, and he caught a portion of the day while fasting. So his fast is considered valid, and that was outside of his control, obviously. So his fast is considered valid. What about if a person sleeps all day? Had the intention at night, woke up for suhoor, prayed his fajr, and just went to sleep. Woke up again 5 minutes before Maghrib. Had a deep sleep, a type of coma sleep. You tried to wake him, he just couldn't get up. He's been doing nights for the past week or something. Right? He's grafted, he's working hard. It's not because he's lazy. Let's not just assume it because he can't be bothered to fast, he wants to sleep it through. No, he's grafted night times, and now Ramadan started. What's the hukum of his fasting? Valid or invalid? Not jaiz. Is it valid or valid? When we speak about fiqh, we can say, is it valid or valid? No, valid. Valid. He was awake for a part of the day, and in the attention at night time. So his fast is valid. Even if he was only awake for 5 minutes, his fast is considered valid because he has the intention. The most important part of fasting is intention. If a person doesn't have the intention at night time to fast in the daytime, their fast is considered invalid. If they wake up in the day and say, I'm going to fast today, Ramadan, it will be considered invalid. And that's why he mentions the next one is intention. النية من الليل لكل يوم واجب. Here, the obligation to fast at night time has to be for every obligatory day. The scholars differ on this issue as well. Ramadan's, the month is here, so I'm at night time, I know I'm going to fast tomorrow and for the rest of the month. Do I have to have an intention every single night to fast the following day, or is it sufficient for me to say, well, Ramadan's tomorrow, I'm going to be fasting the entire month? Right? Is that valid, or do I have to every night have the new intention to fast the following day as a separate act? The scholars differ. The author of the book and the correct opinion is that if you have the intention at night, at the beginning of Ramadan for the entire month, then your fast is valid for the entire month, obviously, because ibadah, Sawm, is just that one act, for example. Even though it's separate days and you break it at night time, your intention is for the entire month. The only time it changes is if you break your fast during the month for a reason, meaning you go on a journey, you travel, or you're going to have a surgery, you're going to have anesthetic or whatever, and you're going to be unconscious for part of the day, so you have to break your fast for that. In this case, at that night, if you're going to fast the following day, you need to renew your intention again. Why? Because you broke your intention in the daytime, so you no longer have the intention to fast the entire month, in which case you have to renew your intention again. As for what the intention means, and it's just the fact that you know tomorrow is going to be Ramadan and it's a month of fasting, so you're going to be fasting. It doesn't have to be very specific. I'm going to fast every day. If it's 29 days, it will be 29. If it's 30 days, it will be 30 days. From this hour, Fajr comes in, up until that hour, when Maghrib comes in. It doesn't have to be like that. It can be general. So that's inshallah with. What about if a person says, he says something like, I'm fasting tomorrow, inshallah. The author mentions it here. This is the last passage in the book, inshallah. He said, inshallah, look. It is the last passage in the book, really. But I still said, inshallah. Likewise, if a person says, I'm going to fast tomorrow, inshallah, that inshallah doesn't show hesitation in the action or doubt. Right? Doesn't show doubt that nullifies the action. Because if you doubt your intention to fast, your fast wouldn't be valid. I doubt I'll be fasting tomorrow, that your fast is invalid. I'm going to be fasting tomorrow, inshallah. It's not the same as I doubt I'm going to fast tomorrow. But I might. They're two different phrases, two different meanings. The one where it says, tomorrow's Ramadan, I'm fasting, inshallah, that saying inshallah, if as long as he doesn't have the, I doubt I'll be fasting, I'm not sure, then his fast is also considered valid. And inshallah doesn't negate or nullify that person's fasting. No. So I only mentioned some other stuff pertaining to intention. I believe that's the point that inshallah I'm stopping at. And the next is continued in the next session. Wallahu ta'ala a'lam wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Apologize to the brother or the Ustadh that's going to be teaching. I think I've got into his time. But I started late, so inshallah I'm excused for sticking to my time, even though I ate into his time. Any questions? Or save them to the end? Save them to the end? To the end of the... Okay.
If you have the intention, but you don't catch the day, it wasn't intentional for you, like, you made the intention to fast the next day, but you woke up and at the adhan, but you didn't catch no part of the day, does it still be valid?
If you had the intention to fast the next day, and he slept the entire day, and he didn't wake up at all until...
Just for example.
For example, until Maghrib time. He slept the entire day. Is his fast valid? Allahu a'lam. I'll come back to you. I'll come back to you by the end of the session, inshallah. But don't do that though, obviously. What a wasted day that would have been. No. Inshallah, people don't do that. It's the same question.
You said if somebody doesn't have adl, then they consider the fasting.
Adala, yeah. The opposite of adala is fisq.
Yeah, fisq. So what happens if the person does sins in private, but they do major sins in private? Would they still, nobody knows about that, would they still be considered a fast?
Yeah. Fisq is fisq. You do it in front of people, you hide it from people, you're still a fasiq.
But the judge wouldn't know.
The judge wouldn't know.
Yeah,
That's not important.
Yeah,
It's not important that people know or don't know.
Yeah.
People know that all the good you do doesn't benefit you. People don't know all the evil you do doesn't benefit you. It's not what people know or don't know, what people think or don't think. Forget what people think, forget what people know. It's not important. What's important is what Allah knows. And Allah knows everything. So what's important is the reality. It's not what you show people, it's the reality. Hypocrisy is what? What's hypocrisy? There's types of hypocrisy. There's kufr, right? You hide kufr in your show Islam. And there's the other levels of it. There's nifaq al-amali, hypocrisy of actions, not of i'tiqad and belief. You show something and you hide something else. You display you're righteous, but in reality you're the biggest mujrim in the city. That's hypocrisy. Right? When he speaks, he lies. When he is entrusted, he breaks his trust. When he promises, he doesn't fulfill his promises. Hypocrisy. He says he's going to do something, doesn't do it. Hypocrisy. So hypocrisy is also a marad of the heart. It's a sickness of the heart. A person has to fight his nafs and not have hypocrisy. No.
Now you mentioned before earlier about a person who is mukhallif or have akals.
Yeah.
One of the people you mentioned was a person who has schizophrenia. Is that in general that if he has schizophrenia? Because my understanding is that if someone has schizophrenia, there are times that they have relapse and there's times that they are.
Jazakallah, good question. I mentioned schizophrenia as an example because when we always speak about mental illnesses, someone might say, well, I've got depression, so I can't fast. Right? And I want to distinguish between losing your mind and having a mental illness which doesn't lose your mind. Right? But you're off sound mind. You're just unhappy. You're very sad. Right? Or someone has anxiety. These are now classed as mental illnesses, but they're not a mental illness which would necessarily affect your ability to fast. Okay? Mental illness is when you're not of sound mind. i.e. you're excused. If you went around and smashed something, you would be excused. You can't say, oh, well, he's just angry, leave him to be. No, he doesn't know what he's doing. He's not accountable for that action in terms of sin or not. Schizophrenia, like the brother mentioned, is different types, i.e. meaning that there's times when the person's not of sound mind and the times when he's of sound mind. He relapses, right? He has different times and stages. At the time when he's not of sound mind, fasting is not an obligation upon him. He's not sinful for not fasting. He's not sinful for not praying. The time when he's of sound mind, he has to pray, he has to fast. It's an obligation upon him. So we're talking about when he's having an episode, not just the fact that he's got the condition, which is an important distinction to make if it wasn't clear from the talk. It's when your mind is not your own. When you're not in control of your actions fully, even though it may seem that person is excused for many things in Islam now. Same question. Okay, we're going to stop there. Barakallahu feekum, jazakumullah khairan. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept it from me and from you and make us reach the month of Ramadan and make the most of the blessed time by doing tilawat al-Quran, qiyamul layl and all the other actions like increasing the sadaqah and good. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us of those who have their sins forgiven in the month of Ramadan and start now from doing the things which are going to be good habits and positive habits which you can take forward into the month of Ramadan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.